My mother gave me 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. She did not say it that way. She said she hoped I would understand that the house needed to feel like a home for everyone in it, and that she and Roland had talked about it at length, and that she thought it would be healthy for me to have my own space at 22. She said this over a dinner she had made, the kind of dinner she made when she needed the atmosphere of the table to soften something she was about to say. Roast chicken. The good plates. A candle I had not seen in months. I sat across from her and listened to every word and understood that the conversation had been prepared in advance. The words were too smooth, too ordered, the way a speech sounds different from a conversation. Roland was not at the table. He was in the living room with the television on at a volume that suggested he was listening. My mother's name is Vivienne. She raised me alone from the time I was 9 years old, after my father left in the particular way that some fathers leave, with a phone call and a forwarding address and a diminishing frequency of contact that eventually reached 0. She worked as a dental hygienist for 21 years. She kept the house. She came to every school event I had. She made roast chicken on the good plates when she wanted the atmosphere of something to land softly. She met Roland when I was 19. He was introduced through a mutual friend at a work function, and by the time I understood he was serious, he was already a constant presence in the house. He was 61 to her 53. Retired from a career he described differently depending on who was asking. He drove a car that was newer than anything we had owned and wore a watch he mentioned more than once was expensive. He was pleasant in the way that people are pleasant when they are performing pleasantness rather than experiencing it. He asked me questions about my life and listened to the answers with an expression of interest that did not change regardless of what I said. He laughed at the right moments. He complimented my mother in front of me with a consistency that felt engineered. I did not like him from the beginning. I have examined that dislike many times since to determine how much of it was legitimate instinct and how much was the ordinary resistance of a daughter watching her mother choose someone new. The answer I have arrived at is that it was both. The ordinary resistance was real. So was the instinct. They married 14 months after they met. A small ceremony at a venue Roland chose. 16 people. My mother in a dress she looked beautiful in. Roland in a suit that fit too well for something bought recently, which meant he had planned for this longer than the timeline suggested. I was a bridesmaid. I stood beside my mother and held her flowers and smiled in the photographs, and meant the smile because she was happy and her happiness was real, and I was not going to put my discomfort up above her real happiness on the day she got married. But I noted things. The guest list was weighted toward Roland's people. His adult children from a previous marriage, a son named Garrett and a daughter named Fiona, sat at the table closest to the couple while my mother's closest friends were farther back. The speech Roland gave mentioned my mother's resilience and her warmth, but described her previous life as something she had endured rather than built. He said she deserved better than she'd had. I thought about the 21 years she had worked and the house she had kept and the good plates she brought out when something needed softening. She had built something. She had not been waiting to be rescued from it. The 2 weeks' notice at the kitchen table came 8 months after the wedding. Roland's retirement was apparently more complicated than presented. He had moved into my mother's house rather than the reverse, which she had explained as temporary while he sorted out a property situation he was vague about. The temporary had extended past the wedding and past the first 6 months of marriage. By the time she was asking me to leave, Roland had been in the house for over a year with no resolved property situation and no clear timeline. I found out later that his adult children had contested a financial arrangement related to his previous marriage, and that the outcome of that process had reduced his available assets considerably. I found that out much later. At the time, all I had was the conversation at the kitchen table and the understanding that the house I had grown up in now needed my room for reasons my mother was not fully articulating. I moved into an apartment with 2 roommates within the 2 weeks. My friend Petra helped me pack and carried boxes down the stairs without editorializing about the situation, which was exactly what I needed. She bought me dinner afterward and let me be quiet over it. My mother hugged me at the door when I left. She held on for a moment longer than usual. I felt in that extra moment something she was not saying, something that lived in the space between what she had chosen and what it was costing her to watch me carry boxes down the stairs. I told her I loved her. I meant it. I drove away from the house I grew up in and began building something that was entirely mine. I did not know then how long it would take before my mother understood what she had chosen, or what it was going to cost her when she found out. I just knew that I was on my own now. I had been on my own before. The apartment was small and the roommates were strangers and the neighborhood was noisier than I was used to. I made it work because making things work was the skill I had been developing my entire life, watching my mother make things work on a dental hygienist's salary with a forwarding address for a father and no safety net of any kind. I knew how to budget. I knew how to show up consistently. I knew how to identify what was essential and release what wasn't. I had graduated the previous year with a degree in finance. Not because I had a specific plan, but because I understood money in the instinctive way of someone who grew up watching it be carefully managed and occasionally not enough. I had taken a position at a financial services firm as a junior analyst. The work was detailed and demanding, and I was good at it in the way you are good at things that match the structure of how your mind already works. My manager's name was Dominic. He was exacting in a way that was clarifying rather than demoralizing. He expected precision and acknowledged it specifically when he received it. He gave me difficult assignments early because he said people learned faster under real conditions than under managed ones. I agreed and proved him right. Within 18 months, I was performing at a level above my role. Dominic recommended me for a senior analyst position that came open when a colleague left. I applied and was given the role and the accompanying change in compensation, which I documented carefully and put directly into savings because I had learned from watching my mother that security was built slowly and deliberately and was not something you could recover quickly once it was gone. I called my mother every Sunday. The calls were warm and ordinary on the surface, and I kept them that way deliberately. She talked about the garden she was maintaining and a television series she was watching and small social events with friends she had kept from her previous life. Roland came up occasionally. She described his activities in ways that were slightly performative, the same way someone describes a purchase they made and are slightly over explaining. I listened and said the right things and did not press on the parts that seemed thin. Petra and I remained close through those years. She worked in healthcare administration and had the practical, unsentimental warmth of someone who dealt daily with situations that required clear thinking over emotional reaction. We had dinner every few weeks and talked about everything. She was the person I told things to when they needed to be said out loud before they could be examined properly. I told her about my mother and Roland in the accumulated way over those years. Not dramatically, just the small, ongoing texture of watching a relationship from the outside and not liking what I saw. Petra asked me once what specifically I didn't like about Roland. She was not challenging me. She was helping me articulate something I had been circling. I told her the specific things. The way he spoke about my mother's previous life as something she had endured. The original property situation that had never been resolved or explained. The way conversations about finances with my mother seemed to arrive and then disappear without conclusion. The way Roland's adult children had maintained a steady presence in my mother's house while I had been asked to leave it. The way my mother's explanations of Roland's situation were always slightly vague at the edges, as though she had been given partial information and was conveying it faithfully without knowing what was missing. Petra said that partial information conveyed faithfully was often not an accident. I kept that in my head. Fiona, Roland's daughter, added me on a professional networking platform 2 years after the wedding. I accepted because I could not think of a reason to decline that didn't seem petty. She sent a brief message saying she hoped we could get to know each other better given that our parents were married. The message was friendly enough, and I replied politely and nothing came of it. But I noticed the connection and filed it. 3 years after the wedding, My mother called me on a Tuesday evening instead of Sunday. She said she wanted to talk about something, and the Tuesday timing told me it was something she had been sitting with and could no longer wait until the weekend to release. She said Roland had suggested they might look at refinancing the house. She said he had an investment opportunity that he thought was exceptional, and the capital from the refinancing would allow them to move on it before the window closed. She said the returns would give them financial security they wouldn't otherwise have at their age. She said all of this in the voice she used when she was conveying something she wanted me to validate. I did not validate it. I asked specific questions. What was the investment? Who was offering it? What was the projected return and on what timeline? What collateral was involved? What happened to the capital if the investment did not perform? Whether a lawyer had reviewed any documentation. The answers she had were incomplete. She said Roland understood the details and that he was the one with the financial experience. I asked what financial experience specifically. She said she would ask him and call me back. She did not call me back that week. She called the following Sunday and said Roland had explained everything fully to her satisfaction and she was comfortable with the decision. She said she appreciated my concern, but she trusted her husband. I sat with the phone in my hand after the call ended. I opened the networking platform and looked at Roland's profile. I looked at the connection he shared with Fiona and the connection she shared with me, and the 3-degree network of connections that extended outward from all of them. I started reading. What I found took 3 weeks to fully assemble and came from sources that were individually incomplete and collectively clear. Roland's professional history was not what he had described. The career he referenced when explaining his financial expertise was real in outline and constructed in detail. He had worked in financial services in a legitimate capacity for the early part of his working life. The later part was a different kind of work that he did not describe on his profile, and that appeared instead in court records that were publicly available to anyone who looked carefully enough. A civil judgment from 11 years earlier. A complaint filed with a state financial regulator 7 years after that. A business dissolution that coincided with the timing of both. The pattern, assembled from 3 separate public records, described a person who had a specific history with other people's money. The previous marriage Roland described in vague terms had ended with a legal process that included a financial dispute his children had initiated. The dispute had gone partially in their favor. Roland's accessible assets after that process were a fraction of what he had presented when he entered my mother's life. He had moved into my mother's house because he did not have a property situation to resolve. He had presented himself with a watch and a car and a history he had edited carefully and a pleasantness that was engineered because it needed to be. I sat with all of it for 2 days before I called a lawyer, not because I needed legal advice for myself, because I needed to understand what options my mother had and whether what I had found constituted something actionable or just something deeply concerning. The lawyer's name was Edmund. He specialized in elder financial abuse and fraud cases. I found him through a referral from Dominic, who had encountered similar situations in client contexts. Edmund was calm and methodical and had the particular quality of being completely unsurprised by what I described. He said the pattern I was describing was not unusual. He said the specific combination of factors, a target with a paid-off asset, a history of financial misconduct, a manufactured relationship timeline, and investment opportunity requiring capital was one he had seen structured the same way more than once. He said the refinancing was the mechanism. The investment was the justification. The house was the target. He asked if my mother had signed anything yet. I told him I didn't know and needed to find out quickly. I called my mother on a Thursday afternoon. I told her I had found some information about Roland that I needed to share with her, and I asked if we could meet in person. She went quiet for a moment and then said Saturday would work. I drove to the house I grew up in on Saturday morning with the documentation I had assembled, printed, and organized in a folder. The kind of folder I put together for client presentations at work. Clear, specific, sourced. Roland was not there. I found out later he had a regular golf commitment on Saturday mornings. I did not know whether my mother had arranged his absence or whether it was coincidence. Either way, I was grateful for it. She made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table and I put the folder between us. I did not tell her what to think. I walked her through what I had found and let her read the documents herself. The civil judgment, the regulatory complaint, the business dissolution, the timeline of each set against the timeline of his entry into her life. The refinancing conversation positioned within that timeline. She read everything slowly. She set each page down with the careful movement of someone who is managing a physical reaction. When she reached the end, she looked up and did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said she needed to talk to Roland. I told her I understood and that I was not asking her to do anything immediately. I told her Edmund's name and number were on the last page and that he handled these situations specifically and could advise her on what her options were. I told her I loved her and that I had found the information because I was looking for it specifically and would not have found it otherwise. I told her Roland had been careful. She looked at her coffee cup. She said she would think about it. I drove home and told Petra everything that evening. Petra sat with her arms crossed and her expression steady through the whole account, and when I finished she said she was sorry and that she hoped my mother could hear it. I told Petra I didn't know if she could. I said some information, even when it was clear and documented and placed directly in front of someone, arrived at a time when the person receiving it was not yet able to let it land fully. That she would need time to sit with what she had seen. Petra asked what I was going to do if she proceeded with the refinancing anyway. I told her I had already answered that question. I had given Edmund a retainer. My mother called me 6 days after our Saturday meeting. She said she had spoken with Roland. She said he had explained that the documents I found were from a complicated period in his life that he had moved past and that the regulatory complaint had been resolved without finding. She said he felt I was motivated by a resistance to their marriage rather than genuine concern. She said she appreciated what I had tried to do, but she trusted her husband. I told her I understood. I told her Edmund's information was still on the last page of the folder and that his number was available if she ever wanted it. I did not say anything else about Roland. She changed the subject to a book she was reading. I listened and talked about the book, and we said goodbye with the warmth we had always maintained on the surface, and I sat in my apartment afterward with the specific heaviness of having done what I could and watched it not be enough. Dominic noticed something different in my focus at work and asked in passing if everything was all right. I gave him the one-sentence version. He said he was sorry and that the worst part of those situations was usually the waiting. I asked what he meant. He said in his experience the information rarely changed the decision in the moment. It changed it later when the thing the information had predicted came to pass, because then the person could locate themselves in a narrative that had been shown to them in advance. He said the value of telling my mother was not in her immediate response. It was in giving her a framework for what she would experience later. I thought about that for a long time. 7 months after the Saturday meeting, my mother called me on a Wednesday evening. Her voice was different. Not upset in the way of an argument. Smaller. Like something had been removed from it. She said she needed to talk. She had discovered, through a bank statement that arrived when Roland was out, that the refinancing had proceeded. She had signed documents 3 months earlier that she had understood as preliminary. They were not preliminary. The capital had been drawn against the house and transferred to an account she did not have access to. The account was associated with an entity she did not recognize. She had called the investment company Roland had named. The number was disconnected. She said the words slowly, like each one required separate effort. I called Edmund while she was still on the phone and put him on a 3-way call. He took the information without audible reaction because he had heard versions of this conversation many times before, and his job was to be useful rather than surprised. He asked my mother specific questions about the documents she had signed and the timeline of the transfer and whether Roland was currently at the house. Roland was not at the house. He had been away since the previous Friday for what he had described as a business meeting. Edmund said he suspected Roland would not return. He said we needed to move quickly on several fronts and asked my mother if she could come to his office in the morning. She said yes. I drove to the house that evening. My mother met me at the door and looked smaller than she had in years, which was not a physical change. Something had gone out of her that the information on the Saturday 6 months ago had not removed, but this confirmation had. The difference between being warned about a fire and finding the ashes. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table. The good plates were in the cabinet. The candle was on the counter. She said she was sorry. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. She said there was. She said she had heard what I showed her and had chosen to believe Roland's explanation because believing his explanation was easier than sitting with what the documents said. She said she had called him that day resistant rather than protective because calling me resistant meant she didn't have to rearrange what she understood about her marriage. She said she had known somewhere from the beginning. I thought about the extra moment at the door when she hugged me the day I moved out. The thing she wasn't saying that lived in the space between what she had chosen and what it was costing her. I told her we were going to figure it out. Edmund spent the following months pursuing every available avenue. Roland had been thorough, but not perfectly thorough. The transfer had gone through an entity, but the entity had connections to accounts that were traceable through legal process. Edmund filed for a civil judgment. He worked with a forensic accountant named Sylvia who specialized in tracing moved assets. He engaged law enforcement through the appropriate channels, which moved at a pace that was frustrating but not immovable. Roland had done this before. Edmund said that was actually useful. Prior patterns of similar conduct strengthened the case and created a paper history that investigators could work with. Garrett and Fiona, Roland's adult children, were contacted by investigators as part of the process. They cooperated. They had initiated the financial dispute after their mother's death specifically because they had seen Roland operate in similar ways before. Their cooperation provided documentation that Edmund's case needed. Fiona's networking connection to me, which she had initiated 2 years earlier and which I had accepted without understanding why she was reaching out, turned out to have been an attempt to establish communication that she couldn't quite bring herself to complete. She sent me a message when the investigation began and said she had wanted to warn me for 2 years and hadn't known how. I told her I understood. The house was not fully lost. Edmund's work through the civil process recovered a portion of the capital. Not all of it. The entity Roland had used had layers designed to complicate recovery. What was returned was enough to clear the refinanced amount and restore the house to my mother's clear ownership. The legal costs consumed some of what was recovered. The remainder was enough to matter. Roland was located 4 months into the investigation in a different state. The civil judgment was enforced. The criminal process moved separately on its own timeline. My mother got her house back. Not everything, but the house. The house needed things after the legal process concluded. Not structural things. It was physically unchanged. What needed attention was harder to name and took longer to address. My mother had lived in it through a year of discovery and investigation and the grinding pace of legal process and the particular loneliness of understanding that the person she had shared the house with had chosen her specifically and deliberately and had never intended to stay. She called me more during that year than she had in the previous 4 combined. Not always about Roland or the case. Sometimes about nothing in particular. The television series, The Garden, a neighbor's new dog, small things. I understood the calls were not about their surface content, and I answered them and stayed on the line as long as she needed. I drove out every other weekend for the first 6 months after the case concluded. I brought food and sometimes Petra came with me, and the 3 of us would spend Sunday afternoons in the kitchen doing ordinary domestic things that filled the house with noise and warmth. My mother started seeing a therapist named Ren about 3 months into the aftermath. Ren had been recommended by a support organization for financial abuse survivors that Edmund had connected her with. My mother said going to therapy felt like admitting something she was ashamed of. I told her it felt to me like exactly the opposite. I told her going to Ren meant she was taking the recovery as seriously as she had taken everything else in her life she had needed to rebuild. She went every week for the first year. She mentioned Ren occasionally in passing, not the content of the sessions, but small observations that filtered through. She said Ren had helped her understand that trusting Roland was not stupidity, that the patterns he used were specific and practiced and designed to move past exactly the defenses that ordinarily protected people, that the shame belonged to the person who had constructed the deception, not to the person who had encountered it. I thought about what Dominic had said, that the value of telling someone was not always in their immediate response, that it was in giving them a framework for what they would experience later. My mother came to that framework in her own time, but she came to it. Garrett reached out to me 6 months after the case concluded. Roland's son, who I had met twice at wedding events and exchanged perhaps 40 words with. He sent a message saying he wanted to apologize for not finding a way to warn my mother before the marriage. He said he and Fiona had discussed it and been paralyzed by the fear of not being believed and by the complication of their own legal situation with their father at the time. He said he was sorry that the paralysis had cost my mother what it had. I told him I appreciated the message and understood the paralysis and held no resentment toward him or Fiona. I meant it. They had tried to protect themselves from a difficult man who was also their father, and the complexity of that position was real. Fiona and I exchanged a few more messages over the following months. Nothing extensive. Just the occasional acknowledgement between two people who had been positioned on the edges of the same situation from different angles. She was thoughtful and carried her own complicated weight from it. I hoped she found Ren's equivalent. At work, the years of building through that period had produced a position I was proud of. Dominic had moved to a senior leadership role and in doing so had recommended me for the manager position he vacated. I had been managing a team of 6 analysts for 8 months by the time the legal case concluded. The work was demanding and the responsibility was real, and I found the combination of both to be exactly the right amount of something to carry during a period when everything outside of work required so much. My team included a junior analyst named Oliver who reminded me slightly of myself at that age. Precise and careful and slightly too willing to absorb the consequences of other people's incomplete work without saying so. I watched him for 3 months before I said anything, and then I said it directly in a private conversation. I told him his precision was exceptional and that it was also not required to be invisible. I told him documenting his contributions was not vanity. It was professional hygiene. He looked at me with the expression of someone who had been waiting to hear something said plainly. I thought about what I had learned watching my mother and what I had built in the years after she asked me to leave. About the difference between the instinct that protects you and the ordinary resistance that is just discomfort. About sitting with a folder of documentation at a kitchen table and watching someone choose not to look at it yet, and understanding that yet was the operative word. My mother came to stay for a long weekend in the autumn. She arrived with a bottle of wine and a plant she said she thought would do well in my apartment's light. We walked in the evening and cooked together and talked about everything in the comfortable way of two people who had been through something significant and arrived somewhere on the other side of it that was not the same as the beginning but was livable and genuine and occasionally even good. She said over dinner that she thought about the Saturday at the kitchen table often. The folder, the documents, the way she had read each page and set it down carefully. She said she knew when she was reading it. She said she had known before I arrived, actually in the way you know things you are not ready to name. She said finding the bank statement was not a surprise in its content. It was a permission. It was the thing that made not knowing no longer an available option. I asked her if she wished I had pushed harder in the Saturday conversation, whether I should have been less measured and more urgent. She thought about it for a moment. She said no. She said the measured approach had left her with her own dignity intact during the process of arriving at the truth. She said if I had pushed, she might have defended Roland more strongly and the defense might have taken longer to exhaust. She said I had done it right. I told her I had learned most of what I knew about doing difficult things right from watching her do them. She looked at her wine glass. She said she had not always done them right. I told her she had done the ones that mattered. We finished dinner and washed the dishes, and she went to sleep in the room that was hers when she visited, and I sat for a while in the quiet of my apartment. I thought about the roast chicken and the good plates and the candle and the 2 weeks notice delivered in a smooth and prepared voice while the television played in the other room. I thought about what it had cost, the boxes down the stairs, the years of Sunday calls maintaining a surface while something underneath was happening that neither of us could fully name. I thought about what came after. The building, the documents, the folder on the kitchen table, the 3-way call with Edmund. The house was still standing. My mother was in it. She was seeing Ren and tending the garden and watching her television series and calling me on Tuesdays sometimes when the Sunday timeline was too far away. We had lost time we could not recover. We had recovered things we might have lost entirely. That was the honest account of where we had arrived. Not the story I would have written for us, but ours, real and imperfect and continuing. That was enough.